Greetings, everyone, and welcome. So, in this section, we'll be talking about Africans in the post-revolutionary era period. And in order for us to have this conversation, we're going to be talking about the aftermath of revolution, both the American Revolutionary War as well as the impact of the Haitian Revolution. And we're going to be discussing the rise of the Cotton Kingdom and also discussing the emergence of a free Black class. All right, so let's get into it. So, during the War of Independence, when the British realized that they were losing the war, they issued what was called the Philipsburg Proclamation, and it said, hey, any Black person who deserts these American colonists and join the British will receive freedom and a farm, right? Meaning full protection, freedom, and land. The American colonies are in this fight for their independence and freedom. This is a chaotic time. We see many enslaved Africans who capitalize upon this and escape, right? And we see more than 100,000 enslaved Africans escaping. And not all of them go to join the British. We can't account for about like 80,000 people, right? But between 15 to 20,000 served the British during the war. And when the British realized and made and had made begun to make their peace with the idea that they were losing this war, they began to retreat. And so in 1783, we see the British beginning to withdraw troops, and unfortunately left many Black people behind that had served to be recaptured and re-enslaved. We also see other Black loyalists resettling in other British territories, right, such as Jamaica, the Bahamas, Florida, and also present-day Canadian provinces of Nova Scotia, as well as New Brunswick. However, all enslaved people who fought for the British prior to November 30th, 1872, were to be freed. And so those people, in order to ensure that they were accounted for, there was a record established, and this book was called the Book of Negroes, right? And so in this book, it recorded the names, ages, and dates of escape of the people, and sometimes would include like brief physical descriptors of them as well. And this was later turned into a mini series that's based upon this book, right? The Book of Negroes, speaking to the Black experience around the Revolutionary War era, and also speaking to the experiences of Black folks who chose to go to Canada. And so 3,000 Black loyalists went to Nova Scotia and were settled in various towns in the area. 1,200 enslaved peoples were also brought to Nova Scotia with their white loyalist masters, right? So we see those colonists who were loyal to the British going to Nova Scotia with their enslaved people. Of all of the towns and all the settlements that were established in Canada, we see Birchtown becoming one of the most populated settlements of Black people outside of Africa at the time. Unfortunately, after arriving in Nova Scotia, promises of freedom, equality, jobs, and land were largely unfulfilled. So we see working and low-paying jobs being offered to Black folks. We see many Africans there being on the brink of starvation. They also were experiencing segregation in all aspects of life, and that was the unfortunate reality for many Black loyalists in Canada. And then in addition to going to British territories that had already been established, we see the emergence of Britain getting their feet wet in colonizing Africa, right? The British not only sent Africans to their territories in the Caribbean and their territories in North America, but they also created a colony on the continent of Africa, right? So the colony of Sierra Leone was created as a repatriation scheme. So in 1786, we see the Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor creating a scheme for repatriation to a territory in Africa where Black folks could be free and govern themselves. And so the interesting thing about this Committee for the Relief of the Black Poor is that it was created because there were so many Black folks in London who were poor, who, because they had been enslaved, and then had been manumitted, but in the process of being freed, had no resources, had little access to economic advancement in the form of good paying jobs, so on and so forth. So there's a large poor community, so much so that, we begin to see the creation of an entire colony to figure out what do we do with all these Black folks. And not just those there in London, but also what do we do with free Black populations, because the vast majority of our territories still have slavery. Because, mind you, Britain didn't abolish slavery until 1833. Folks who initially went to Canada deciding, bump this noise, we're going to go back home to the motherland, even though, for many of these Black loyalists, Sierra Leone or that region was not where they were from, right? But in 1792, 1,200 Black loyalists set sail for Sierra Leone, and they established the colony of Freetown. One Black loyalist that I want to highlight was Richard Pierpoint. So Richard Pierpoint was born in Senegal, and he was kidnapped and sold into slavery in 1760. He escaped enslavement and became a loyalist, right? And he earned his freedom in the American Revolution, serving in Butler's Rangers unit, and he was honorably discharged. And so then Pierpoint settled in the Niagara region and fought in the War of 1812, right? The War of 1812, British and Indigenous folks against the United States, right? And so you have Pierpoint creating a colored corps, right? So other Africans who want to fight for the British. So after the war, he requested passage back to West Africa, but was denied, and instead was given 100 acres of land in what was then an uninhabited township called Garifraxa. Pierpoint was known to be a gifted storyteller, a respected community leader, and an advocate for the Black community, advocating for Black folks to be able to have plots of land separate from white people, because the white folks of Canada were particularly hostile, saying that, hey, we need safe Black spaces for ourselves and in order to be able to protect ourselves and each other. So Black patriots after the war. So we see between anywhere from 5,000 to 8,000 Africans serving the Continental Army. And many Africans that fought for their freedom during the Revolutionary War were not granted their freedom. There was a promise of freedom for some, but for those who were unfree, they were not given their freedom, many of them. Of those who even fought during the war, we only see 500 Black patriots applying for the Revolutionary War pension. Also in 1792, U.S. Congress formally excluded Africans from military service. So in relation to race and the Constitution, so the Constitution never outright utilized words that pertain to race or pertain to slavery. So they didn't use words like white, Black, Negro, etc., or the word slave or slavery. But they still managed to talk about slavery in the Constitution. And so specifically in relation to the Three-Fifths Compromise, as well as the outlawing of the transatlantic slave trade, and also even including a fugitive slave clause. The Three-Fifths Compromise spoke to debates between northern and southern states around legislative representation as well as taxation. You have the North, which had far more people than the South, but the South had more people, just many of them were enslaved, right? And so you have many Southerners who are like, hey, my enslaved people should count, even though they're not being represented, even though they can't participate in our government at all. They should still count towards my political power. And the North was like, no, it's a horrible idea. So the Three-Fifths Compromise came about, in which you have 3 out of every 5 enslaved peoples being counted when determining a state's total population. So basically, you could consider it, and many people consider it to being Black people being considered to be 3/5 of a human being, right? Because they're not considered as full peoples, but 3/5 of a person in relation to legislation and taxation. And so the Three-Fifths Compromise, or the Three-Fifths Clause, increased the size of the South's congressional delegation by 42%. So additionally, the Constitution prohibited Congress from outlawing the Atlantic slave trade for 20 years. So they said you have to allow the slave trade to continue. You cannot make any laws against it until 1808. And that is when the transatlantic slave trade was outlawed by the United States. This does not mean that slavery was abolished, right? But simply that the trade in kidnapped Africans and the process of bringing them to the Americas, to the United States specifically, was outlawed by the United States. This also doesn't mean that it was outlawed everywhere, right? So it wasn't outlawed by the Portuguese, for example, or the Spanish or the Dutch, right? Just the United States. So we also see the Fugitive Slave Clause requiring the return of runaway slaves to their owners, and the Constitution gave federal government the power to put down domestic rebellions, including enslaved insurrection. Concluding the American Revolutionary War, we see Black loyalists who are trying to forge freedom in new lands. We see Black patriots realizing the hypocrisy of freedom. And we also see, the nation's governing document, including aspects of inequality in the process of trying to secure freedom for white Americans who were middle and upper middle class and men. All right, take care of yourselves and stay tuned for part 2.